Good morning, guys. Let's start, even though some of you, in fact 10 or something like that, are not there yet, but what can we do? All right. So today, what I want to do is to go into the structure of the essay and analyze how Heidegger builds his path. In fact, let's use the word that he uses, and we'll clarify a second also why he stresses so much the word path and avoids other more technical and maybe more scientific sounding words. Before doing that, let me break you a news. I don't know if you've heard, probably you're too young even to care about this, but today is a rather sad day because one of the most amazing phenomena that ever appeared, at least in the sphere of football, died. Have you heard of the name of Maradona? Well, unexpectedly, he died last night. Yeah, so it's a very sad thing. And all for someone of my generation who has seen Maradona playing. In any case, so rest in peace, and let's go ahead talking about the essay. Okay, so the essay, The Principle of Identity. In this essay, as you know, because you read it by now, Heidegger tries to develop a reflection on one of the basic principles of thinking, namely the principle of identity. What does the principle of identity state? It states that A is like A. A is A. Now, Heidegger notices from the start that this principle doesn't state a tautology, because if it were to state a tautology, it would be an empty formulation. I trust that all of you know what a tautology is. A tautology is an expression whereby we say, for example, the chair is the chair, or the plant is the plant, and we don't say anything else about it. So a tautology is a mere repetition. Now, the principle of identity clearly is not a tautology. The principle of identity states instead something regarding the thing that it talks about. And what does it state? In Heidegger's words, the principle states that each thing is the same with itself. Heidegger starts elucidating this point by quoting a passage in Plato, in which Plato uses in an almost redundant way the formulation a thing is the same with and through itself. A thing is the same with itself through itself, because it keeps itself in itself. Hence, the principle of identity is the principle of what we can call self-sameness. Identity means self-sameness. From there, Heidegger notices that the first time in which something like the principle of identity, even though it was not stated as a principle, has been formulated, was in that famous fragment of Parmenides that reads, being and thinking are the same. How has this fragment been interpreted? It has been interpreted by reading it as if it were to say that being and thinking belong together. They are in a belonging togetherness. And the stress has been put on this together. Now, this together, zusammen, this together, stressing this together, makes us think of the relation of thinking and being as the result of some kind of joining, some kind of mediation through a junction. And that's the way in which the relation between thinking and being has been thought of, has been conceived of by the tradition. In the relation, behind the relation between thinking and being, we must read the relation between men and being. Once this relation is understood in terms of togetherness, hence in terms of joining, one can alternate between the two poles as for which one is the dominating pole. That is to say, as for which one is the pole that imposes the junction. For ancient metaphysics, for Platonic and Aristotelian thought down to scholasticism, the pole that imposes the junction, the pole that determines the joining together, is that of being, namely thinking, i.e. the human being, is joined to being, hence to all that is, under a predominance of being itself. We'll see later what being means in this perspective. Whereas in modern philosophy, from Descartes on, from late scholasticism, and then mostly from Descartes on, this joining together has its point of origin and emphasis on men. Men thinking, understood as the thinking of a sovereign subject, is what creates the reality of things, is what imposes to things their being. Now, let's open a parenthesis and understand what in the frame of metaphysics, both ancient and modern, being comes to mean. In the acceptation of this word as used both in ancient and modern metaphysics, being means the entity, that is to say, all the various entities. So, for the ancients, down to Descartes excluded, the relation between thinking and being is one whereby being, understood as entities, is what shapes the form that thinking takes. To speak even in more simple terms, the relation of agreement, of adequation that holds between thinking and being understood as entities is determined by the entities and not by thinking. In modern philosophy, instead, this relationship is reversed, and entities become real and hold up in their being real only because a subject, that is to say, a thinking that is understood as the operation of an isolated and ontologically different mind, a subject projects on them their reality, thus forming them in as many objects. The first, clearest, and in a way most explicit example of this is found in the philosophy of Descartes. For Descartes, the reality of the world outside of us is established and is determined by an act of thinking which finds its legitimacy in the fact that it follows along certain eternal categories. Hence, at that point, as I said before, what do things become? Things become objects. But what is an object? An object is the projection, literally, projection. That's what object means. Something that is thrown in front. Projection. Something that is thrown in front. Things become objects resulting from the activity of a subject, where subject now means that underlying operating principle, i.e. the human mind, i.e. thinking, which in its operation determines entities. Hence, as I said before, you can see here how being and thinking, once understood under the stressing the category of togetherness, are understood as joined together, either with the predominance of being, that is to say, of entities, or as a predominance of thinking on being understood as entities. So let me stop here. Is it clear for everybody so far?
No, Prof. I'm not sure I'm clear, but is it okay if I repeat what I write down, then it's even right? Yeah. So you mentioned, okay, so identity holds up real because a subject project onto them on their reality. So the subject is underlying principle where determines entities.
Mm.
So and the actual things will actually become an object because object is a projection resulting from the activity of a subject.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. But do you see this? Can you give me an example of this, for example? An example of this, for example. Can you give me an example of this to see whether you have actually grasped what, because you know what I just gave you and you repeated correctly is a formula, but this formula is used to summarize something, right? So give me an example of this something. I mean, I make this, I'm doing this to be sure that you and all of you are grasping what we're talking about.
Okay, maybe I give you an example of a tree. The tree's holds real because of its entities. And the whole tree holds up real because human subjects projects onto their reality. So human means that human do have an idea of a tree in order for the entity of the tree to exist. So, and so now, so the things become an object. So this tree is originally just a collection of atoms, but now it becomes an object tree to human because of the human observing the tree from the process of thinking and everything. Yeah. So, so the underlying principle is how human thinks and itself, how human think about itself and the relation to others, which this activity itself resulting the formation of the tree. Is that right to say that?
Sort of. You are sort of getting there, but you must be careful and be more precise. You said a tree is just a collection of atoms, right? And then we already in the moment in which you say the tree is just a collection of atoms, you are saying that because you are thinking that that's the most secure thing, the most assured thing to say about a tree. Correct? And starting from which do you think that that's the most secure and certain thing to say about the tree? You say that out of a presupposition. This presupposition states, even though you don't know it, but you are working under this presupposition. This presupposition states that what is true is what can be mathematically and physically described and calculated. And why do you start from this presupposition? Because there is another presupposition behind. And this presupposition behind states the following. Between me and things, there is no direct communication. So I cannot know things per se. I can only know what I already know. And what is it that I already know? Mathematical principles according to which I can calculate. So once mathematical principles become the only source of certainty, you approach anything starting from them. And at that point, things have become the resulting object of the projection on them of a mathematically shaped approach. You see, that's the projection that Descartes operates. And the very fact that you started by saying a tree is just a bunch of atoms, and then I built something on it, without realizing that in saying a tree is just a bunch of atoms is already a projection, right? It already presupposes a projection at work with two presuppositions beneath it. This shows us how much each of us is completely within the mental frame that determines the working of modern philosophy. That's why I kept saying to you that, to you guys in general during the course of the semester, that the operation and the operations and the presuppositions of the various sciences are philosophical in nature. And that's why I kept telling you that the modern world is a European world. I guess you're Chinese, right? You're from China.
I'm in Singapore for more than half of my life, actually.
Ah, okay. So, but you know, you are ethnically Chinese, okay? And you never lived in Europe. Yet you think precisely in the manner in which a modern European has been accustomed to think since Descartes on. And yet you don't know it. So let us repeat to clarify again. What does modern philosophy say? It says that between us and things, there is no direct communication, point A. Given the fact that there is no direct communication, we must find a way to be certain of what we say about things. That is to say, we must find a way to be certain of their reality. How do we do that? By, first of all, finding what we know for certain. And what is it that we know for certain? Well, we know for certain that we think, and hence we exist. And then we know for certain that we think according to certain pieces of evidence that we know before interacting with anything outside of us. Which are these pieces of evidence? Mathematical principles. Can we approach things through mathematical principles? I mean, things that are outside of us? Yes, we can. Does it work? Oh, yes, it works. And in fact, it allows us to do a lot of things. At this point, what have things become? Things have become mathematically graspable objects. So what is the truth? What is the ultimate reality of these things for us? The fact that they are mathematically organized congregations of matters. Mathematically organized congregations of pieces of matter.
Professor, at this point,
and in this sense, they've been turned into objects. The word object, it's a modern word, above all in the acceptation it has now. And it defines a very particular way of grasping things. Okay? In German, because German, like Greek, is a superior language, is a semi-divine language. I'm convinced that the gods speak both Greek and German. They have two words to talk about what we call object. They have the word Gegenstand and the word Objekt. Now, the word Gegenstand is used mostly just to mean literally something that stands gegen, against, in front of. Das Gegenstand, das Gegenstandes, is what stands in front of me. So it can be a bottle, it can be, I'm not saying anything of that thing aside from the fact that it's a thing that stands in front of me. And then Objekt in German means instead what I just explained to you, namely a thing grasped in its reality as the result of the projecting on it of mathematical schemes, of mathematical categories. Okay? So an Objekt in German is something that pertains mostly to the language of philosophy and the sciences. A Gegenstand, instead, it just says of the thing that stands in front of us. I can say in German, das Gegenstande Baum, the tree that is in front of me. And that's it. But if I say das Baum als Objekt, the tree as object, I'm saying another thing. I'm saying that I'm looking at the tree as an object, hence as something whose reality I grasp only through mathematical principles. Okay? So this distinction is very important. Furthermore, on the word object, I told you is a modern word, right? In ancient Greek, you do have the word andikimenon. But again, in ancient Greek, andikimenon means exactly what Gegenstand means in German. And interestingly enough, you don't find the word antikimenon as a key word of philosophy, in ancient philosophy. All right. So in this thing of the emergence of the object, of the category of the object, you find that relation of togetherness, that relation in which togetherness prevails between being and thinking, in which thinking has the upper hand, that I was talking about before. Okay? So being is understood implicitly just as entities. Being is flattened up against entities, and in turn these entities are understood as what is determined by the activity of thinking, i.e. of men. And what is the chief activity of men? That of projecting on the outside the reality of what that outside is. By the way, other parenthesis, let's think a second of the word reality. Reality is a word that you use and everybody uses as synonymous to things, to actuality, to what surrounds us, to the world, and blah, blah, blah. But reality actually says something very specific. Reality is a Latin word. It comes from the Latin realitas, which in turn is a philosophical word, which in Latin appears, in philosophical Latin appears very late. You don't find it in ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. You don't find it in scholasticism. You find it only later, after Descartes. Remember that Descartes, even though he was French, he wrote in Latin. Leibniz who was a German, wrote in French and Latin. So when I talk about late Latin philosophical usage, you have to think of these guys. Latin kept being the language of culture up to basically 150 years ago. Okay, so the word realitas is a late word of philosophical usage, and it is formed from the word res. Now, what does res mean in Latin? Res in Latin means thing. For example, you say res publica, the public thing. Res privata, the private thing. Republic comes from res publica. But res in itself, what does it actually mean? Res in itself, R-E-S, res, is connected, comes from the verb reor. Reor in Latin means to calculate, like the German rechnen. And like the English write. So res means thing, but thing is already understood as the measured and measurable. So what is reality? Why did people like Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant choose this word to designate the outside, to designate what surrounds us and our bodies? Precisely because they had already grasped them as objects determined by projecting on them, or determined as projections of mathematical principles. So reality presupposes a relation to things understood as the measured and the measurable. Okay, this is very important. It is very important to understand this because, as I just showed you by elucidating what Gibault was saying, as I showed to you, we are completely steeped in this mentality, completely steeped, to the point that we don't see it anymore. But to a man coming from another culture, or a man coming from another time, or an alien, or a man of the future that will hopefully be in a different kind of mindset, these other men would be looking at us and at the way in which we approach things as weird specimens. Pretty much the same way in which we look at past civilizations that have disappeared, or at cultures that have not been assimilated to our modern culture. We look at them as weird specimens. And we're able to see the presuppositions that they work on, that based on which they deal with things that they themselves don't see, that they take for granted. So it is extremely important that you understand what has happened from Descartes on. And whatever has happened from Descartes on, Heidegger, in a genial way, and that's where you see the stroke of genius, right? In a genial way, Heidegger says, well, what has happened from Descartes on is the fact that being and thinking, which in their relation have been thought of as being joined, as joined together, as kept together through a junction, the togetherness, being and thinking in their junction have been thought of as thinking determining being. where being, as I said already many times, is already tacitly understood as entities, as identical to entities, which is very problematic also because being is not identical to entities. Okay, is this clear to everybody?
Can I say that Heidegger's approach is an admission that we can never know things in an objective sense, and instead falling to a completely subjective view of reality where the human being and all it knows via its thinking is the only reality that we can know.
No, you're talking about Heidegger.
Yes, correct.
No, I mean, the point is to snap ourselves out of the dichotomy subject-object. Okay, so subject, the way you use it, means whimsical, which is one of the meanings that the word subject has taken in modern time. The other meaning that the word subject has taken in modern times, since Descartes on, is the underlying the underlying thing, under, sub, lying, yectum, from yacho, from yacheo, I underline. What is this underlying thing? Is the I that knows that it is because it thinks, okay? And how does this, what else does this I know for sure? This I knows for sure, as we said before, the clear and distinct ideas, namely those ideas that to be known do not need any interaction with the outside. And what are these clear and distinct ideas? Mathematical ideas. Understood in this sense, the subject is the source of the only possible certainties. So it means the opposite than whimsical. And it is this subject that establishes the objectiveness of things. Once the objectiveness of things is established as the correspondence to geometrical mathematical categories that determine the way in which the subject I works, whatever doesn't correspond to this is subjective in the sense of whimsical. So let me give you an example. This is an example that I make many times, and probably you've heard it already. Imagine that I give you a piece of cake, okay? And you were to tell me, oh, this is too sweet. And I were to discard what you're saying, that the piece of cake is too sweet, telling you, oh, that's your subjective idea. In this piece of cake, there are, I don't know, 50 grams of sugar, 30 grams of chocolate, and 40 grams of flour. And that's exactly the proportion that should hold there. And the objective thing about this cake is not that it's too sweet or not sweet enough, is that it contains this much sugar. Now, what have I done? I have de facto reduced the cake in its ultimate reality to what of that cake is measurable, namely the amount of sugar, flour, and chocolate that it contains or is made out of, right? And I have discarded of the cake whatever is not calculable, hence how much it appeals to you, hence the things that it makes you feel, or a series of things. or what it might mean when given in certain circumstances, what it represents in terms of relation to the rest of the world, and so on and so forth, right? All that has been cast under the name, the category of subjective in the sense of whimsical. The objective being the measurability. Now, Heidegger invites, and in doing this, right, we have determined that entity. That entity has become what is determined by a projection of certain categories belonging to thought. Heidegger invites us to snap out completely of the dichotomy object-subject. Okay? And he makes us reflect on, first of all, the fact that this dichotomy, subject-object, is a certain way of interpreting the togetherness of being and thinking. Okay? It's a certain way that has emerged in modern times, whereby you have a subject that projects and thus determines an object, and reality is the ensemble of objects. Okay? Whereas in antiquity, until Descartes, before Descartes, up to Descartes, the same relation between, the same relation between thinking and being, the same togetherness, was thought of as being having the prevalence. And also in that case, being was understood as entities. Which meant what? Which meant that the cake in front of me is not primarily a mathematical and geometrically describable reality. It is something much more complex, looking at which my thinking has to find a way to describe according to different categories. And by doing that, my thinking adequates itself, becomes similar, or to use an idiomatic expression in English, wraps itself around the thing. Okay? So Heidegger makes us notice that, first of all, this dichotomy subject-object comes out of a certain way of interpreting the relation between thinking and being. And second, he makes us notice, as a second step, well, he doesn't do it explicitly in this essay, but he does it all throughout the book. He makes us notice that this identification between being and entities, which underpins the entire development of Western thinking, is an unwarranted one. Okay? All right?
Okay, Prof. But to clarify, Heidegger starts from the point of Parmenides, which is that thinking is being, but doesn't the fact that thinking is mentioned allude to or admit to that the subject, not as seen as, subjective as whimsical, but the subject of the person is the starting point.
Okay.
Similar to Descartes.
Parmenides says, "Togαραυτον noin estinte keine." So if you translate it literally, Parmenides says, the same indeed is thinking and being. Which one is the subject of this sentence? To αυτό, the same. Grammatically, the subject is the same. In fact, the verb is in the singular. So, είναι and noin, being and thinking, are predicates in Parmenides' sentence of to αυτό, of the same. The same indeed are thinking and being. In fact, now I'm thinking that I should go back to my translation and actually translate it this way. Because it makes absolutely clear what Heidegger is saying. So in Parmenides, you don't have the prevalence of the subject that you find in Descartes. And in fact, the rest of ancient philosophy, which comes after Parmenides, doesn't show the prevalence of the subject that you find in Descartes. I mean, you don't have anything like the subject in ancient philosophy, okay? In that sense, Heidegger can say that in the entirety of the metaphysical tradition, both ancient and modern, if we start thinking from that crucial sentence of Parmenides, we notice that what has gone unheeded is the fact that the subject of this sentence, of that sentence, is to αυτό, the same. Whereas the tradition, the entire tradition, has interpreted it as if it were saying that thinking and being, subjects, grammatical subjects, are the same. That is to say, the tradition has interpreted it as saying being and thinking together, joined. Whereas Heidegger is saying the same is thinking and being, which can be turned into thinking and being belong into the same. The same, in other words, contains both thinking and being. At this point, this same, as Heidegger stresses, doesn't mean so much a together, that is to say, a being joined, but points rather to a belonging. Do you see this?
I see it. I at least superficially understand it, but I think it's going to take a long time before I can understand the implications of what that means.
Oh yes, I mean, don't even try to understand everything at once, because I mean, as I said, look, even though I've been thinking about these things now for a long time, okay, I started studying philosophy in a serious way. Even though I don't have a degree in philosophy, by the way, I have a degree in classical philology, but my dissertation thesis was, my PhD dissertation, sorry, was on Plotinus and St. Augustine. So we're talking about 2010, so 10 years ago. I started studying these things in 2007, so 13 years ago. In fact, even more, 2006, so maybe 14 years ago. And then I ventured into Heidegger 7 years ago, and Heidegger is the one that actually put on my nose the two truly philosophical lenses with which I've learned to to look at these texts and then at reality at large. Well, my point is that in these 16 years, only recently have I started really grasping some of these things. And then even when I think that I have a grasp of them, it remains difficult to really hold onto them. And believe it or not, every time I have a class with you guys, on the one hand, I enjoy it enormously. On the other is one of the most fatiguing activities that I do during the day. Because putting one's thoughts in order and making sure that, yeah, this passage is correct, this passage is correct, and is actually saying, it makes sense, is extremely strenuous. Now, how come that it's so difficult to grasp these things? Because as I said before, we swim in them. These things try to touch on those deep presuppositions that we swim on, we swim through. It's like the air we breathe, and we don't realize it. And when we try to talk about them, of course, it becomes extremely difficult. It's like as difficult as becoming aware of your breath and then following the rhythm of your breath. How long can you do that? Not for very long. And yet when you do that and you manage to do that, what you feel is a sense of relief and elation in a way. Well, the same thing with these things. Once you become aware of these presuppositions that we breathe all the time, and you start thinking along, you start putting your thought on a path that makes you think along these presuppositions and question them, then what you have is a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation almost. Okay, so don't even try to grasp everything at once because you won't.
Hi, Professor. I actually wanted to ask a question about Descartes earlier, because you mentioned that the subject is the thing that we are most certain about, whereas we consider any opinions from other people, like regarding the sweetness of a cake, to be completely whimsical. How is it that at the same time we can regard our own subjective views as the most certain, but the views of others as completely whimsical?
Because when we say subjective, we're not talking about, again, my subjectivity in the sense of my taste, of my inclination. The subject, technically understood, is that universal mind, which is identical in every human being, which judges, which operates according to certain universal principles, which are the same for every singular I. What are these universal principles? The geometrical, mathematical ideas.
But how does one grasp themselves, like their own consciousness, in a mathematical way? Because I cannot
That's a great question. That's when Heidegger says, well, how can, that's when Heidegger says in several passages that Descartes has not really stopped to interrogate the meaning of this I am in his famous statement, I think, therefore I am. What is this M? Descartes doesn't do that. So your observation is acute. However, if we stay at the level of Descartes, in order to understand what Descartes has done, Descartes has looked for the ultimate unshakable certainty. Okay? And what is this ultimate unshakable certainties? That I am insofar as I think, because I think. The fact that I am thinking now is proof, is evidence, not even proof, is evidence actually, of the fact that I am. But implicitly, what does this am mean? It means that I'm thinking, that I am the act of thinking, okay? And what does thinking mean for Descartes? Recognizing certain unshakable universal principles that are in their turn immediately, that is to say, without the mediation of the outside, are immediately evident. What are these things? The mathematical geometrical principles. What happens to all the rest that I am as well? Descartes doesn't take care of it. That's why Heidegger can say Descartes has not paused and pondered what is this M. Is this clearer?
Yes, it's much clearer to me now because when I was thinking about it, Descartes didn't actually address that aspect because he just takes consciousness for granted in the meaning of everything that is factual or certain.
All right. Let's see. Are there any more questions? Let's see if the cake is a lie. What is the Latin word for Gegenstand? The Latin word for Gegenstand is objectum, okay? Out of which object comes. Now, objectum is like realitas, a word that has entered Latin and philosophical Latin quite late in the history of the language. For example, you won't find the word objectum used in a technically crucial way in medieval Latin philosophy or in imperial Latin philosophy. You find it only from Descartes on, okay? Above all in Leibniz and then in Kant, because Kant, by the way, wrote also in Latin. I don't know if you know it, but it is so. So in Latin, the word for Gegenstand is objectum, but then objectum in Latin becomes a philosophically charged technical word, okay? All right. By the way, it's very interesting to follow the history of these words. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if anybody has ever written something like a history of these words, but the words subject, object, they have a long history that goes back to ancient Greek, because in ancient Greek, subject is hypokimenon, and actually you have found it in Plotinus. Plotinus uses the word hypokimenon 3 or 4 times in the little treatise that we read. I translated it not as subject, but as substratum. That is to say, literally the underlying thing. And Aristotle himself uses the word hypokimenon many times, but they don't have in mind, when they use it, anything like the word, like what the word subject in modern philosophy says. It would be really interesting to go and investigate precisely from the lexical point of view, when and how did the meaning of these 2 words, hypokimenon, antikimenon, first get translated into Latin, and then when did these words started taking out the meaning that they then have in modern philosophy. This would be a very interesting philological investigation. To my knowledge, nobody, has done it. Maybe I should do it, but the problem with philological stuff is that they're extremely tedious. In any case, let's see, someone, is it possible to fully embrace the being of an entity by thinking about it? Well, we have to understand what we mean by being, okay? So Weimin is asking, is it possible to fully embrace the being of an entity by thinking about it? We must clarify, first of all, what do we say when we say being, okay? Being as opposed to entity. We must clarify that to first, to be able to address this question. Now, as a way of a quick answer to this, let me tell you what I already started telling you last time. For the ancients, the being of things is understood ultimately as the entity. That is to say, being is flattened up against anything that is. Any one of the various beings that surround us. I am a being, my chair is a being, my books are beings, my dogs are beings, each one of you is a being, the bottle in front of me is a being, meaning something that exists. So being with the capital B has been by the ancients tacitly equated to each single being. Okay, so being has been flattened up against entities tacitly. This implies that the ancients understood being as what is, as what abides in front of me. Which is something I explained to you in the supplementary text. I explained to you very quickly. Then the ancients, starting from this understanding, asked what each thing truly and most deeply is. And they said, well, each thing is its idea. And the idea, the ethos, is the ultimate ousia, as Aristotle says. Where ousia means what? The stability of what each thing is. So even more, being is flattened up against the entity, and once it is researched in itself, it is found starting from the entity as the ultimate concentrate of what each single thing is. So what is the being, the true being of a dog? Dogginess. And what is this dogginess? It's de facto the concentrate of dog, right? What is the true being of, I don't know, tree, of trees, treeness, the concentrate of tree, right? The idea of tree, the ousia of tree. So if we stay in this perspective, which is the perspective that has marked philosophy ever since its inception, then we can answer Weimin's question positively. Yes, if you observe entities acutely enough, then you'll be able to reach the true being. But what you are saying there implicitly is that being is the underlying, concentrated essence of the manifestation of each single entity. So being is understood as, in each case, an other entity which represents the truest form of the entity in front of you. Okay? Heidegger instead stresses the fact that things can abide in front of us. So Heidegger starts from the same observation of the ancients. Things abide in front of us. He starts from this observation and then he says, yes, they abide in front of us because of being. But being is not an entity. Being is radically different from beings. Can we grasp being starting from beings, as philosophy has been doing? No, we can't. We must try to grasp being per se. How do you do that? That operation is extremely difficult, and yet is a necessary one. Why is it difficult? It's difficult because what is asking us to do is to, for a moment, suspend what we take to be the most clear evidence, namely the presence, the abidingness of entities, and to look instead at that thanks to which anything that abides in front of us can abide, namely being. So it's difficult because of this leap that it asks us to do. But it's necessary if you want to go deep into this question of how things abide and thanks to what things abide as things, thanks to what beings are beings. It is necessary because we can perceive things as things, or put in other words, beings abide in front of us starting from being. So being is that presupposition, is that, not presupposition, is that opening ground within which and starting from which things can abide as things. That's why it's necessary to ask that question. I'm aware of the fact that these are head-breaking things. This will cause quite a headache. And as I told you, don't think that for me it's easy to talk about these things. Every time is really an effort. So take your time. Don't be scared if you don't understand immediately. You must take your time to chew on these things. My suggestion to you is to do what I do. Keep rereading the same stuff, trying though every time to reread it, not just blindly, but holding on certain points that you grasped. It's like when you climb, how do they call it? Not climbing. You know, those people that go up a mountain with their hands and feet. How do they call that? That's called, I don't remember. There is a name in English for that. Is it called climbing as well? I don't remember. Mountain climbing, yeah, something like that. But you know, the one with your hands and feet, right? Where you are actually on a mountain wall and you're going up, grasping as you go.
Bouldering.
What?
Bouldering.
Bordering. Okay. Well, that thing, right? So think of that. How does that work? Every time for you, rock climbing. Yeah, rock climbing. Yeah. Thank you, Sean. So rock climbing. When you do rock climbing, what happens? How can you do rock climbing? You can do it if, on the one hand, you have in view where you're going. Second, each step up, in order for you to make each step up, you must secure your feet and your hands to something. And then see ahead of you which one is the next point on which you can secure your grasp. Okay? So when you reread these texts, you have to do the same, reminding yourself of what you have grasped that far as the most solid. Try to take a step further. Now, be prepared to the fact that you can also fall back. I don't want to bore you now also because I'm running again over time, so I have to let you go. But in my research history, even regarding Plotinus, I've been falling back many times, at least 2 or 3 times, 3 times for sure, with this treatise on which finally I decided to write something. So it's a strenuous work, okay? Now, for now, I have to, could I check when would you need to turn? Yeah, the final essays are for week 14. I would say, given the fact that I need to correct them, Monday of week 14, okay? Turn them in Monday of week 14. And I'm gonna open up a thing on eDimension for you to upload them, all right? Now let me stop here, otherwise I'll get another problem. All right, bye guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
See you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Bye.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.